Hey there guys, Music Fan here again. How you guys doing? We're almost done with the U2 discography review, and well, whether it's 11 o'clock at night, we're going to go on an album review. Today we're going to review U2's 12th studio album, No Line on the Horizon, released in 2009. So let's get talking about this album because there's a lot to say about this album. So this album, when you compare this album to their previous two studio albums, All That You Can't Leave Behind and How to Dismantle an Atomic Bomb, it is definitely different. It is a different album than those other two, and the reason for that is because this time around, U2, seeing, even though Atomic Bomb in of itself was widely successful, especially with the track Vertigo as its flagship song, U2 had a lot of not as much detractors, but U2 found that they felt that the perception, at least amongst their hardcore fan base, was that Atomic Bomb was a little too safe, a little too generic, and a little bit U2 by numbers kind of album. So instead, the band decided to travel to Fez, Morocco, along with principal producers Brian Eno and Daniel Lanois, along with them, to record, to re-embrace experimentation, to re-embrace that sense of bold, daring adventures that the band took with albums such as The Unforgettable Fire, The Achtung Baby, in some ways even All That You Can't Leave Behind, even though that was more of a rock band oriented album. Instead, they absorbed a lot of the elastic Fez Moroccan musical atmosphere that is always around that particular location of the country, and decided to absorb that kind of style and that kind of sound into their rock sound, literally. And it was originally going to be a little bit more ambitious. It was going to be a lot more more along the lines of the Fez Moroccan sound. In fact, I even saw some videos on YouTube of the band taking some local Fez Moroccan street musicians and recording their instrument parts onto U2's music, and that was going to be great. That was going to be awesome. But along the lines, U2 realized that they had pushed their experimentation too far, to the point that they didn't have any suitable material to play live with or to tour with. And of course, touring is an essential part of U2's not only financial stability, but their fan stability, their music stability, along with their music. So the band instead decided to scale back on the ambition and really bring down to a more band format for this particular album, while retaining some of the Moroccan experimentation that they first started out with. So yeah, songs like Moment of Surrender, Unknown Caller, White as Snow, Breathe, Cedars of Lebanon, these tracks would not find a comfortable place on their previous two albums, because those tracks alone, compared with those two albums, are experimental. However, when you compare this album as far as its experimental standard is concerned, it's not as daring or is not as adventurous as U2's 90s albums, but not by a long shot. With U2's 90s albums, you apparently get that the correlation between the rock band U2 and the experimental U2 are just very non-linear, that you couldn't tell U2 from the Joshua Tree and U2 from Achtung Baby. You couldn't tell that they were literally the same band. This time, however, even though there's still a sense of lack of correlation, some would argue that No Line on the Horizon, the songs are a little bit like the stuff on Behind an Atomic Bomb, especially the first single on here, Get On Your Boots, which not which is very Vertigo-esque in terms of its riff and its main propulsive riff and Adam's bass playing and Larry Mullen Jr.'s drumming. Um, the thing with that track though is that not only is it does it have a rock side to it, it has a hip hop texture to it, it has a electronic texture to it, it has a indie texture to it in a way. So it's like a lot of jumbled things rolled into one, which upon its release really perplexed the audience, and really they couldn't figure out what to make with a song like Get On Your Boots, and ended up being one of U2's worst ever singles released. That kind of goes to show how U2's ideas or their thoughts, their thinkings that this has to be a hit album, kind of conflicted with the public's perception of what makes for a great song. And but maybe I'll get to that in another video. But literally, this album is a way more experimental and way more emotional album than either previous Atomic Bomb and All That You Can't Leave Behind. And those albums had their big emotional moments too, but this time around there is really big emotion on here. I think of tracks like Moment of Surrender, which really comes very close to the original concept for this album, being of an album that is meant to have feature hymns and whose melodies will continue for a lifetime. That's really the song that comes closest to that idea. I also think of tracks like Unknown Caller and White as Snow, which are really, Unknown Caller being a really long experimental song, which really has a very stellar solo from the Edge near the end of this track, and White as Snow being a very chilled and very relaxed kind of song with a very cool operatic part from Bono, vocally at least. You also have your rockers on here, of course. Get On Your Boots is one, but you also have the title track, No Line on the Horizon, which really starts off this album off in fine form. Also, I think of tracks like Breathe, which really has this really awesome drum solo at the beginning of this track by Larry Mullen. I also think of tracks like Magnificent, which really is the track that really marries U2's knack for great anthemic rock songs, and their knack for experimentation, in this case, Fez Morocco, and putting them both together. And that's one prime example of this, of the rock tracks. Also, I'll Go Crazy If I Don't Go Crazy Tonight. Kind of windy title in my mouth. This track, is also anthemic, but this is probably the song where Bono's political speeches shows its fullest, at least for me, and that kind of comes off to mixed results to me, But musically, it's all right. I like this track, but it's not really my favorite. Really, stand-up comedy. Also, that track too is a bit of a rock-oriented song, with a very short guitar solo from Edge. Not really so much a solo as it's a very processed guitar slide. Really, also Fez Being Born, the first part being a collage of Fez Moroccans walking around the local area, and Being Born being this super awesome rock, pile driving rock song, which it's such a shame, because I really would think this song would have worked well live, would have been a perfect opener for the 360-degree tour. At least in my opinion, it would have been a perfect opener. Then you have like a really meditative, stoic songs such as White as Snow and Cedars of Lebanon, the latter portion of which is a very subtle, subdued, and very atmospheric track on here. I mean, like Bono making a very small but very apparent condemnation on the Iraq War. Choose your enemies carefully, for they will define you. Really kind of ends this album off on probably the most enigmatic closer of a song in U2's catalog, and I myself was very perplexed when this album ended on this particular song, and I remember thinking, what the heck did U2 just give me? Um, but either way, this album, you know, it's a hard album to pin down. It was a hard album for the general public to pin down, even though this album did sell about 3 million copies, which is not really bad. It's rather a very miracle um, number to sell in the at least in the year of 2009. Um, but either way, this album really perplexed me the first time I heard it, because in months prior I had heard comparisons to Octoon Baby, that this album was going to be U2's most experimental effort since Octoon Baby, that Bono singing was on fine form, a lot of those kind of things, and there's a lot of theories as to why No Line on the Horizon didn't do so well. Some people said it was the choice of the first single, that Get Our New Boots wasn't representative of the rest of how atmospheric and deeply meditative that the rest of the tracks are. Some people said it was the change of the music industry. Other people said that U2 tried to have sold a really experimental album to a single buying public who loved more so Lady Gaga's material than U2's. Um, in my opinion, I think one of the reasons of this album's failures is the categorization of this album's sound months prior. I think if you were going to compare an album like this being the most experimental effort since Octoon Baby, then you're kind of pulling the expectations of the public into the wrong one. When I heard that this album was going to be as experimental as Octoon Baby, I kind of thought, oh my gosh, we're going to get not exactly like tracks off of that album or the other two, but I was expecting something as bold, as daring, and as adventurous as those three albums, and what I got initially was an album that I didn't expect, and was an album that at first really disappointed me. In fact, if I would have started my channel back in 2009, I would have torn this album a new one, and I would have labeled this to be the worst U2 album the band has ever recorded, and I was really that furious, the very experimental nature of this album, even though when compared to the 90s U2 isn't that experimental, it it really put U2's future, at least for the next few years, into serious doubt, and their relevancy into a very serious question. And a lot of people then were starting to label U2 as kind of a has-been kind of band, and that their time was up. It was fearful, especially for me, that No Line on the Horizon was going to be the death knell for the band. Of course, we'll see with Songs of Innocence, but that's for that album. As to what do I personally think of this album, or what do I personally rate it, it was really hard for me to put a rating for this album, because on the one hand, I want to viscerally hate this album, but on the other hand, I've grown to, I won't, this is definitely not my favorite U2 album by far. At least for me, it's not my favorite U2 album ever. I'm sure there are fans out there who would consider this to be their best album, and kudos to them, great. But for me, it's kind of a very middle of the road kind of album. It's an album that, me personally, I don't declare this to be my favorite U2 album ever. In fact, this is an album I wouldn't necessarily recommend to newcomers of U2's music. If you want to start on here, fine, be my guest. More power to you. But for me, I wouldn't think that this is the most representative or the best of what U2 has to offer. There's Joshua Tree, there's Behind, maybe Atomic Bomb, Boy, October War. Those albums are perfect introductions, but yeah, I've grown to appreciate this album. I don't necessarily love this album, but I've grown to kind of understand this album on its own particular merits. So, And I've gotten to like a lot of the songs off of here, even though I won't necessarily rank these amongst my favorites. So yeah, really hard album for me to pin down. I mean, the most that I can conjure up as a rating is somewhere between a 3 and a 2.9, really barely under the 3 point mark. I mean, this is an album that, even though I viscerally despised when it first came out and when I first listened to it, I've grown to kind of like it. I've grown to kind of appreciate it, and it's an album that I appreciate, that I like, but it's not an album that I necessarily hold in this high hierarchy, or this really high standard of an album. Like, I mean, like, in other words, I admire U2 and I admire this album for its ambition. I admire this album for the risks that it took. I admire this album for really being an album that took a big giant risk, and really, without an album like this, we would not have U2 would not have been given the initiative to really fight hard and really try to overcome the odds to create for the next album to be their best one yet. And of course, we'll get to that album next time. But as a rating for this album, either a 3 or a 2.9, or maybe even a 3.5. I mean, it's really middle of the road kind of album. Not their worst album ever, but not necessarily their best. I will say this though, that for all the talks of, this is their worst album ever, really, for a band to sell 3 million copies in the year of 2009, me personally, even though this is not an album I glaze over, this is not an album that I love, it's the old saying, like, some artists' worst work are still better than others. This album, compared with most other bands' works, at least for me, this is still an album that I would say, even though many people often pin this album to be U2's worst ever effort yet, I still think to this day that some bands' worst are still better than most artists' best. And for me, even though No Line on the Horizon may be a little bit on the bottom of the scale, at least for me, I would still much rather listen to this album that U2 still put their hardest effort into, try to experiment, try to take a big gamble, a big risk, to save their artistic integrity from becoming a very hollow shrill than a 3-minute pop song about how fancy you are. Those are my final thoughts. Yeah, that's it. That's all I have to say on No Line on the Horizon. Leave your comments. I really want to hear your comments on this album, because I know you have a lot. Leave them in a comment section below. Tell me what you think. Do you love this album? Do you not like this album? Why or why not? And that's it. U2, No Line on the Horizon, and that's it. See you guys next time.